Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the convention.
And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe.
Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 today of our conclusion on the life, legacy, death, and gravesite of John Jay. I hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday, taking a look at John Jay's early life and his kind of early political career. John Jay, as I said, he was a man that did quite a lot. A lot of accomplishments, a lot of things that he did in his life, a very big legacy. I wanted to cut it off where I did yesterday in part 1, only because it was leading right up to the time of the Federalist Papers that we'll go over today, plus the very first election, the very first presidential election in our United States history. So that's why I kind of cut it off where I did. Now, keep in mind, today we're going to go over the elections that John Jay technically was a candidate in, but it was a lot different back then, because with the first election and second election, George Washington obviously won both of those. You know, it wasn't like people were campaigning like we know today, or even like we knew back in the mid-1800s and late 1800s, where people would actively campaign, and there would be campaign posters and flyers and all this stuff. It wasn't like that during this time. It was just kind of a list of a bunch of people, candidates, if you will, that were kind of up for the possible presidency. And then there was, people that voted on it. That was really it. It wasn't like we know of today. So John Jay, even though technically he did run for president, as you will find out, he didn't really overly campaign or try to, vehemently go against George Washington. It wasn't like that. So just keep that in mind as we're going over things here. So, all right, let's get right into it. You guys know the drill. Hit the like button, the thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Leave those comments and questions below, please. The only other thing I did want to touch on really quickly is this video is probably being released on Friday, October 18th. So I need to give a very, very big happy birthday shout out to Mr. Henry. Henry's birthday is October 18th, so it would be today. I just want to say happy birthday to him. He is 11 years old now. 11 years old, it's hard to believe. When we first started this YouTube channel, Henry, at the time, was only 7 years old. So you guys have definitely seen a lot of growth over the last 4 years or so with Henry. And I love you very much, Henry. It's a pleasure to be your father and to watch you grow up. And I thank you for all the wonderful memories and adventures that you and I share together. All of these things that I go see, for the most part, probably 85 to 90% of them, I do with Henry. And it's very special. I understand that he's a young kid, and he may not really realize right now at his age that it's important and it's meaningful. But I hope someday when he's older, he looks back on these times and memories that him and I have shared, and he remembers the good times, because some of my best memories of my entire life were when I was young and my father and mother would take me down to Baltimore, Maryland to see Baltimore Orioles baseball games and go to the aquarium in Baltimore and do that kind of stuff. Some of the best memories of my life. So I hope Henry remembers all these things that him and I do together. But a very big happy birthday. Love you very much. Happy birthday, Henry. Here we go now. Let's get into our conclusion of John Jay. John Jay believed his responsibility was not matched by a commensurate level of authority, so he joined Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in advocating for a stronger government than the one dictated by the Articles of Confederation. He argued in his address to the people of the state of New York on the subject of the federal Constitution that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and an ineffective form of government, contending the Congress under the Articles of Confederation may make war, but are not empowered to raise men or money to carry it on. They may make peace, but without power to see the terms of it observed. They may form alliances, but without ability to comply with the stipulations on their part. They may enter into treaties of commerce, but without power to enforce them at home or abroad. In short, they may consult and deliberate and recommend and make requisitions, and they who please may regard them. John Jay did not attend the Constitutional Convention, but he joined Hamilton and Madison in aggressively arguing in favor of the creation of a new and more powerful, centralized, but balanced system of government. Written under the shared pseudonym of Publius, they articulated this vision in the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 articles written to persuade New York State Convention members to ratify the proposed Constitution of the United States. Jay wrote the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 64th articles. The 2nd through the 5th are on the topic Dangers from Foreign Force and Influence. The 64th discusses the role of the Senate in making foreign treaties. So the Federalist Papers, those essays that were written by obviously Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, they were extremely influential and really they helped shape the U.S. Constitution as we know it today. That's really very truthful. That's not an understatement or an overstatement. They truly did. Very interesting stuff. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to start to discuss the first presidential election of 1788/1789 that ever took place. And I'm going to explain to you how John Jay technically was involved and a candidate. So basically, obviously, we came up with this concept of we need a president to obviously run the country. George Washington at the time, he was obviously a distinguished former commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. And George Washington agreed to come out of retirement. And when he did that, he was elected unanimously with ease. Now, Washington did not select a running mate because that concept was not even yet developed back in 1788. So basically what it was the Constitution created the offices of president and vice president, okay? They were fully separate from those offices from Congress. And the Constitution at the time, well, still to this day, of course, they also established the Electoral College. And basically it was based on each state's congressional representation in which each elector would cast 2 votes for 2 candidates. Now, that whole procedure was modified in 1804 by the ratification of the 12th Amendment. And states had varying methods for choosing presidential electors. In 5 states, the state legislature chose electors. The other 6 chose electors through some form involving a popular vote, though in only 2 states did the choice depend directly on a statewide vote. I know it's kind of confusing, but bottom line is the Electoral College was formed. They came up in the Constitution with the Electoral College and the president and vice president. And, all right, so what are we going to do? This is the first time we're doing this, right? George Washington comes out of retirement. He wins unanimously. He wins every electoral vote. Nobody else wins anything. Now, no former political parties existed at the time. But, however, an informally organized, consistent difference of opinion had already been manifested between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So even though there wasn't political parties, there was this differing of opinions. So thus, the contest for the vice presidency was wide open. Okay, Thomas Jefferson predicted that a popular northern leader, such as Governor John Hancock of Massachusetts or John Adams, a former minister to Great Britain who had represented Massachusetts in Congress, would be elected vice president. But anti-federalist leaders such as Patrick Henry, who did not run, and George Clinton, who had opposed ratification of the Constitution, also represented potential choices. So Washington wins unanimously for president. Then, after that, it's a matter of, okay, who's going to be the vice president now? So at the time of our first election, there was only 69 electors, okay? So all 69 electors present cast one vote for Washington. Remember, they make 2 votes each. They all cast one vote for Washington, making his election unanimous. John Adams won 34 electoral votes as for the second vote cast. The remaining 35 electoral votes were split among 10 candidates, including John Jay, who finished third with 9 electoral votes. So the first votes, remember the electors, there's 69 of them, they all vote twice. All 69 voted for Washington. He's unanimously the president. Now they all vote, all 69 of them vote again to find out who will be the vice president. 34 out of those 69 went to John Adams, and he became and won the vice presidency. 10 other candidates received the other 35 electoral votes. John Jay was the third highest vote getter, though, because he received 9 of those 35 electoral votes. So, he did receive votes. Technically, obviously, he wouldn't be president, but did he technically run for president / vice president? Well, not really. He didn't run, but he was eligible, and his name was obviously thrown into the mix. So there you have it. So now 3 states were ineligible to participate in the election. New York's legislature did not choose electors on time, and North Carolina and Rhode Island had not ratified the Constitution yet. So New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island were not participating. George Washington won, of course. He was inaugurated in New York City on April 30th of 1789, 57 days after the first Congress convened. Now, so we know what happened with John Jay. Now, as far as candidates went, John Jay was basically under the umbrella of a Federalist candidate. The Federalists, just to throw out some names for you, were people like John Adams, John Jay, Governor of South Carolina, John Rutledge, Governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, Governor of Connecticut, Samuel Huntington, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, Benjamin Lincoln. So those are just some candidates. Now, anti-Federalist candidates, probably the most well-known, well, there's probably 2 that would have been the most well-known, were people like Patrick Henry and George Clinton, who was a governor of New York. So there you have that, just so you can get an idea. Now, let me talk a little further here. As I had said, there was no nomination process that existed at the time of planning for a president or an election. The framers of the Constitution presumed that Washington would be elected unopposed. For example, Alexander Hamilton spoke for national opinion when, in a letter to Washington attempting to persuade him to leave retirement to serve as first president, Hamilton wrote to Washington, "The point of light in which you stand at home and abroad will make an infinite difference in the respectability in which the government will begin its operations in the alternative of your being or not being the head of state." So everybody was kind of just assuming that Washington would come out of retirement and automatically be president. But the other uncertainty here, obviously, was the choice for vice president. And the vice presidency, it contained no definitive job description beyond being the president's designated successor and presiding over the Senate. That was really it. The Constitution did stipulate that the position of vice president would be awarded to the runner-up in the presidential election. And because Washington was from Virginia, which was then at the time the largest state, many assumed that electors would choose a vice president from a northern state. In August of 1788, a letter, U.S. Minister to France at the time, Thomas Jefferson, wrote that he considered John Adams and John Hancock, who were both from Massachusetts, to be the top contenders for vice president. Jefferson suggested that John Jay, John Rutledge, and James Madison as other possible candidates. Adams received the 34 electoral votes, one short of a majority, because the Constitution did not require an outright majority in the Electoral College prior to the ratification of the 12th Amendment to elect a runner-up as vice president. So that's how all this went down. But Jefferson did definitely mention John Jay as names that he thought should definitely be considered as vice president. So we do know that, of course. Let's see what else here. So as far as the presidential candidacy, the popular vote, every vote went to Washington, 100%. All 69 electoral votes in the first vote went to Washington. John Jay received 9 electoral votes. It went John Adams 34, John Jay 9, and then the next closest person there was a tie. 2 guys had 6, which was Robert H. Harrison of Maryland and John Rutledge of South Carolina. They each had 6. So John Jay did finish 3rd. So I mean that's kind of really it as far as John Jay in the first presidential election, kind of the whole thing that happened, what it was all about. But of the remaining candidates after Washington, only John Adams, John Jay, and John Hancock received votes from more than one state. They're the only 3 that received votes from more than one state. Just to give you an idea, John Jay received 3 votes from Delaware and 5 votes from New Jersey and 1 vote from Virginia. So 3 Delaware, 5 New Jersey, and 1 from Virginia to make up John Jay's 9 electoral votes in the very first presidential election of 1788/1789. So there you have it, John Jay in the first election. So I hope I kind of cleared that up a bit. Obviously, I just wanted to point out about how different it really was, obviously, back then during our first and second elections. It's still the same general concept of democracy and everything else. We know that. But it was just a much different process than what we know of today, or not even today. Even if you go back 150 years ago or so, it's a much different process than what we've been used to for many, many, many decades here in our country as far as the election process and the way everything went down back then. So, moving on here now. In September of 1789, George Washington, of course, is now first president, and John Jay declines George Washington's offer of being Secretary of State, which was technically a new position, but would have continued Jay's service as Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Washington responded to Jay after he declined by offering him the new title, which Washington stated must be regarded as the keystone of our political fabric, as Chief Justice of the United States, which John Jay accepted. George Washington officially nominated John Jay on September 24th of 1789, the same day he signed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the position of Chief Justice into law. John Jay was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate on September 26th of 1789. Washington signed and sealed Jay's commission on the same day. John Jay swore his oath of office on October 19, 1789. Washington also nominated John Rutledge, William Cushing, Robert Harrison, James Wilson, and John Blair Jr. as associate judges. Harrison declined the appointment, however, and Washington appointed James Iredell to fill the final seat on the court. John Jay would later serve with Thomas Jefferson, who took Rutledge's seat, and William Patterson, who took Johnson's seat. While Chief Justice, John Jay was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1790. Jay served as Circuit Justice for the Eastern Circuit from the spring of 1790 until the spring of 1792. He served as Circuit Justice for the Middle Circuit from the spring of 1793 until the spring of 1794. The court's business through its first 3 years primarily involved the establishment of rules and procedure, reading of commissions and admission of attorneys to the bar, and the justice's duties in riding circuit over presiding over cases in the circuit courts of the various federal judicial districts. So Jay, at the time, didn't have a big workload, and he used this time as a justice to participate freely in the business of Washington's administration. John Jay used his circuit riding to spread word throughout the states of Washington's commitment to neutrality and publish reports of French Minister Edmond Charles Guinet's campaign to win American support for France. However, John Jay also established an early precedent for the court's independence in 1790, when Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton wrote to Jay requesting the court's endorsement of legislation that would assume the debts of the states. John Jay replied that the court's business was restricted to ruling on the constitutionality of cases being tried before it, and refused to allow it to take a position for or against the legislation. For his work as Chief Justice, John Jay was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree by the University of Edinburgh on May 17th of 1792. Now, there is a bunch of, very, very interesting cases that John Jay obviously presided over as Chief Justice. The Jay Courts, as it was known, Jay Courts' first case did not occur until early in the court's third term. That was actually West versus Barnes. Then there was the Hayburns case. There was Chisholm versus Georgia. There was Georgia versus Brailsford, I should say, Brailsford. I'm not going to go over each case. I'm not going to tell you the exact in and outs of each case. If you're interested, obviously, go, look it up, Google it. But several cases that John Jay presided over that were pretty instrumental and pretty important cases, obviously, early on in the Supreme Court. Probably the most significant, it's debatable, but I would say Chisholm versus Georgia is probably like the most significant. So if you want to look up the cases, feel free to do so. So now that kind of leads us right up to the time of 1792, which would have been, of course, the second presidential election. And, by this time, by 1792, a party division had definitely emerged between Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who basically he desired a stronger federal government with a leading role in the economy. And the other party was the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who favored states' rights and opposed Hamilton's economic program. The elections of 1792 were the first ones in the United States to be contested on anything resembling a partisan basis. In most states, the congressional elections were recognized in some sense as a struggle between the Treasury Department and the Republican interest. To use the words of Jefferson strategist John Beckley. In New York, there was a race for governor that was fought along the same lines. The candidates in that race for governor of New York were Chief Justice John Jay, who was a Hamiltonian, and the incumbent governor, George Clinton, who was the party's vice presidential nominee. So, definitely some interesting things. Now, keep in mind, John Jay didn't receive any votes in the second presidential election. He was more concentrated at that time for his campaign for governor of New York, because that was during 1792. So he was actually trying to run for governor of New York. So I'm going to get into that now. John Jay's campaign to be governor of New York in 1792. In 1792, John Jay was the Federalist candidate for governor of New York, but he was defeated by Democratic Republican George Clinton. John Jay received more votes than George Clinton, but on technicalities, the votes of Otsego, Tioga, and Clinton counties were disqualified and therefore not counted, giving George Clinton a slight plurality. The state constitution said that the cast votes shall be delivered to the Secretary of State by the sheriff or his deputy. But for example, the Otsego County Sheriff's term had expired, so that legally at the time of the election, the office of sheriff was vacant and the votes could not be brought to the state capitol. Clinton partisans in the state legislature, the state courts, and federal offices were determined not to accept any argument that this would, in practice, violate the constitutional right to vote of the voters in these counties. Consequently, these votes were disqualified. Relations with Britain verged on war in 1794. British exports dominated the U.S. market, while American exports were hamstrung by British trade restrictions and tariffs. Britain still occupied northern forts that they had agreed to abandon in the Treaty of Paris, as the Americans had refused to pay debts owed to British creditors or halt the confiscation of Loyalist properties. In addition, the Royal Navy impressed U.S. sailors who were alleged to be British deserters from the Navy, and seized almost 300 American merchant ships who were trading with the French West Indies between 1793 and 1794. Madison proposed a trade war, a direct system of commercial hostility with Great Britain, assuming that Britain was so weakened by its war with France that it would agree to American terms and not declare war. George Washington rejected that policy and sent John Jay as a special envoy to Great Britain to negotiate a new treaty. John Jay remained the Chief Justice. Washington had Alexander Hamilton write instructions for Jay that were to guide him in the negotiations. In March of 1795, the resulting treaty, known as the Jay Treaty, was brought to Philadelphia. When Hamilton, in an attempt to maintain good relations, informed Britain that the U.S. would not join the Second League of Armed Neutrality, John Jay lost most of his leverage. The treaty resulted in Britain withdrawing from their northwestern forts and granted the U.S. most favored nation status. U.S. merchants were also granted restricted commercial access to the British West Indies. The treaty did not resolve American grievances about neutral shipping rights and impressment, and the Democratic Republicans denounced it. But Jay, as Chief Justice, decided not to take part in the debates. So basically what happened was Jay was sent over there to England by Washington to negotiate a treaty. The treaty that he negotiated did solve some of the differences with Great Britain, but it was definitely very unpopular back here in the United States. Many critics found the treaty, which, keep in mind, President Washington did support the treaty, but critics found it to be too favorable to the British. But Jay's treaty did help delay another costly war between the United States and Great Britain until the War of 1812, though John Jay paid the price in popularity. His effigy was burned in several U.S. cities, and John Jay himself reportedly joked that he could travel at night from Boston to Philadelphia by the light of his burning effigies. So people did not really like it. They were not really totally in favor of it. It was lambasted by the Jeffersonians, really, for favoring the British, so they did not like it at all. But, it was something that obviously Washington favored and backed, so obviously it went through. Before Jay's treaty, John Jay really had been seen as a possible successor to George Washington for the presidency. But now, after the treaty was done, all presidential hopes were ruined for John Jay. It was just pretty much over with at that point. Democratic Republicans were incensed at what they perceived as a betrayal of American interests, and Jay was denounced by protesters with such graffiti as "Damn John Jay," "Damn everyone who won't damn John Jay," "Damn everyone that won't put lights in his windows and sit up all night damning John Jay." One newspaper editor wrote, "John Jay, the arch traitor. Seize him, drown him, burn him, flay him alive." John Jay himself quipped, as I said, that he could travel at night from Boston to Philly solely by the light of his burning effigies. He definitely was not popular after the Jay Treaty happened. Which kind of leads us right up to the presidential election of 1796, This is the third presidential election in our country's history. Now, Washington was retiring after 2 terms. He wasn't doing any more terms, as he said. So both parties sought the presidency really for the first time. Before the ratification of the 12th Amendment in 1804, each elector was to vote for 2 persons, but was not able to indicate which vote was for president and which was for vice president. Instead, the recipient of the most electoral votes would become president, runner-up would become vice president, as we had already said about these elections. Now, in the 1796 election, the Federalist candidates, the Federalist nominee ended up being John Adams, who was the incumbent vice president and a leading voice during the Revolutionary period. Most Federalist leaders viewed Adams, who had twice been elected VP, as Washington's natural heir. That's what they just saw him as. Now, John Adams' main running mate was Thomas Pinckney, a former governor of South Carolina who had negotiated the Treaty of San Lorenzo with Spain. Pinckney agreed to run after the first choice of many party leaders, former Governor Patrick Henry of Virginia, declined. Alexander Hamilton, who competed with Adams for leadership of the party, worked behind the scenes to elect Pinckney over Adams by convincing Jefferson electors from South Carolina to cast their second votes for Pinckney. So, Hamilton did prefer Adams to Jefferson and urged Federalist electors to cast their votes for Adams and Pinckney. The Federalist candidates were Adams, Pinckney, Oliver Ellsworth, John Jay, James Iredell, Samuel Johnston, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. The Democratic Republican candidates were Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, Samuel Adams, and George Clinton. Now, in the results of it, what happened was John Adams received 71 electoral votes. He received 53.3% of the popular vote. Thomas Jefferson came in second with 68 electoral votes. He received 46.7% of the popular vote. And John Jay received 5 electoral votes. He received 5. Thomas Pinckney, Aaron Burr, Samuel Adams, Oliver Ellsworth, and George Clinton all finished with a larger amount of electoral votes than John Jay did. Now, here it is by state, as I always like to do. John Jay, all 5 of his electoral votes were from the state of Connecticut. That's it. No other state voted for John Jay. 5 votes from the state of Connecticut for John Jay. So that was the 1796 election that saw John Adams become the president. John Adams became our second president, of course, and John Jay only received 5 electoral votes. So, there you have it. Now, this brings us up to the time of, it's around 1796, so we're around that 1795, 1796 time frame. Let's learn a little bit more about John Jay. So while he was in Britain during the Jay Treaty negotiations, John Jay was elected in May of 1795 as the second governor of New York, succeeding George Clinton as a Federalist. John Jay resigned from the Supreme Court service on June 29th of 1795, and he ended up serving 6 years as governor until 1801. As governor of New York, John Jay received a proposal from Hamilton to gerrymander New York for the presidential election of 1796. He marked the letter proposing a measure for party purposes which it would not become me to adopt, and filed it without replying. President John Adams then renominated him to the Supreme Court. The Senate quickly confirmed him, but John Jay declined, citing his own poor health and the court's lack of the energy, weight, and dignity which are essential to its affording due support to the national government. After John Jay's rejection of the position, John Adams successfully nominated John Marshall as Chief Justice. While governor, John Jay ran in the 1796 presidential election, winning 5 electoral votes. And he ran in the 1800 election, where he won 1 vote cast to prevent a tie between the 2 main Federalist candidates. We're going to get into that election right now. So as we said, in the 1800 presidential election, Alexander Hamilton, in response to Federalist defeat, attempted to get governor at the time, John Jay, to call a special session of the outgoing Federalist-dominated New York legislature. Hamilton's plan was for the outgoing assembly to pass legislation that would establish the popular election of electors through electoral districts, a strategy almost certain to secure 9 or 10 of the 12 electoral slots for the Federalists. John Jay refused to participate in such an underhanded scheme, as we had kind of touched on. Now, in regards to voting in the 1800 election, so under the U.S. Constitution as it then stood, each elector cast 2 votes, and the candidate with the majority of the votes was elected president, vice president, runner-up. The Federalists, therefore, arranged for one of their Rhode Island electors to vote for John Jay instead of Charles Pinckney to prevent the election from resulting in a tie. So John Jay was kind of involved, kind of not. He kind of just was dragged into it, so to speak. There was kind of several disputes, defective certificate. So when it happened, basically, if Georgia ballots had been rejected based on these supposed irregularities, there was a bunch of irregularities. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr would have been left with 69 votes each, one short of the 70 votes required for a majority. There was all sorts of things going on, meaning a contingent election would have been required between the top 5 finishers, who were Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, incumbent President John Adams, Charles C. Pinckney, and John Jay. They were the top 5 finishers. So, as you can see, John Jay really wasn't running, but he was dragged into all this. The results of the election, Thomas Jefferson won, okay? However, John Jay did receive 1 electoral vote. He did receive 1. And when we go by state, the electoral vote he received was from the state of Rhode Island. They did this in hopes to break the tie. So, because what would have happened is then that would have went to Pinckney, who was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney at the time, and there would have been a tie. So it would have been very messy. So they just made the decision to have the Federalists vote in Rhode Island for John Jay. So John Jay did receive 1 electoral vote in the election of 1800, but it was to break a tie. That's all it was. So that was really it for John Jay when it came to elections and when it came to the possibility of running for any sort of significant office of president or vice president. That was it for him. So, kind of interesting. Then comes kind of his retirement. But first, before we get into the retirement, I would like to discuss John Jay's relationship with slavery and his views on slavery. All right, so John Jay and slavery. So, it's interesting to me because a lot of these founding fathers who we know were slave owners, and we know they had some very, very hypocritical views, I should say, on slavery. You always see, like, on the website, like, if you go to, like, John Jay's Homestead website, you'll see, that it was a complex relationship with slavery. John Jay's and his family's relationship with slavery was so complex. It's not complex. It really comes down to they were slave owners. They had enslaved people. And yes, you have to give some, I don't know if I want to use the word credit, but you have to say, well, at least John Jay changed his views on slavery, or he realized how wrong it was. That is good. That is a good thing. But it doesn't change the fact that his family did own slaves. So let's get into that with John Jay and slavery right now. The Jay family participated significantly in the slave trade as investors and traders, as well as slaveholders. For example, the New York Slavery Records Index records. That's very strange the way that's worded. The New York Slavery Records Index records, I should say, that John Jay's father and paternal grandfather as investors in at least 11 slave ships that delivered more than 120 slaves to New York between 1717 and 1733. John Jay himself purchased, owned, rented out, and manumitted at least 17 slaves during his lifetime. He is not known to have owned or invested in any slave ships. In 1783, one of John Jay's slaves, a woman named Abigail, attempted to escape in Paris, but was found, imprisoned, and died soon after from illness. John Jay was irritated by her escape attempt, suggesting that she be left in prison for some time. To his biographer, Walter Starr, this reaction indicates that however much John Jay disliked slavery in the abstract, he could not understand why one of his slaves would run away. Despite being a founder of the New York Manumission Society, John Jay is recorded as owning 5 slaves in the 1790 and 1800 U.S. censuses. He freed all but one by the 1810 census. Rather than advocating for immediate emancipation, he continued to purchase enslaved people and to manumit them once he considered their work to have afforded a reasonable retribution. Abolitionism, following the American Revolution, contained some Quaker and Methodist principles of Christian brotherly love, but was also influenced by concerns about the growth of the black population within the United States and the degradation of black people under slavery. In 1774, John Jay drafted the Address to the People of Great Britain, which compared American slavery to unpopular British policies. Such comparisons between American slavery and British policies had been made regularly by patriots, starting with James Otis Jr., and took little account of the far harsher reality of slavery. John Jay was the founder and president of the New York Manumission Society in 1785, which organized boycotts against newspapers and merchants involved in the slave trade and provided legal counsel to free blacks. The society helped enact the 1799 law for gradual emancipation of slaves in New York, which Jay signed into law as governor. An act for the gradual abolition of slavery provided that from July 4th of 1799, all children born to slave parents would be free, subject to lengthy apprenticeships, and that slave exports would be prohibited. These same children would be required to serve the mother's owner until age 28 for males and age 25 for females. It did not provide government payment of compensation to slave owners, but failed to free people who were already enslaved as of 1799. The act provided legal protection and assistance for free blacks kidnapped for the purposes of being sold into slavery. All slaves were emancipated by July 4th of 1827. In the close 1792 gubernatorial election, John Jay's anti-slavery work was thought to hurt his election chances in upstate New York Dutch areas where slavery was still practiced. In 1794, in the process of negotiating the Jay Treaty with the British, Jay angered many Southern slave owners when he dropped their demands for compensation for American slaves who had been freed and transported by the British to the other areas after the Revolution. Again, John Jay, he was a slave owner. He did believe that slavery was not okay. He did believe that, as a matter of fact, he has a quote, and the quote goes such as this: "Every man of every color and description has a natural right to freedom." John Jay, February 27th of 1792. So again, he did realize that it was wrong. He was for abolishing slavery, but it was a slow roll. A lot of it was political. Even though it hurt his chances of becoming governor of New York in 1792, possibly, it's still a very political thing back in this time, period, and in this day and age, because John Jay dragged his feet a bit, just like a lot of them did. He was persistent and an effective advocate for the abolition of slavery. The journalist Horace Greeley concluded in 1854, "To Chief Justice Jay may be attributed, more than to any other man, the abolition of Negro bondage in this state," meaning New York. So, yeah, he did play a role in abolition, but it's still kind of skewed, in my opinion. There's also a really great article that I found on the New York Times that was written about Abigail, the enslaved woman that died in Paris trying to win her liberty. Basically, as John Jay was negotiating the freedom of our new nation. Obviously, he was over in Paris, as we know, negotiating. He had brought this enslaved woman that he owned, Abigail, with him and his family. And there's the only real knowledge that we have of Abigail, and according to this article, is letters. And, what we know of Abigail's fate and the 18 months that she was in Paris, it's letters from John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and their families, basically as they worked to thwart her efforts to get free. So, again, he was for abolishing slavery, but this particular incident with Abigail, this enslaved woman, it incensed John Jay. He could not understand why someone that was a slave of his wanted to become free and to run away and to get away from it all. He just couldn't wrap his mind around that. But it's a very, very interesting article. I'm not going to read it because it's quite long. It goes into a lot of French cities and French locations that I could not even begin to pronounce correctly. But it's very interesting. It's on the New York Times. It's called Enslaved to a Founding Father, She Sought Freedom in France, is the name of the article. Enslaved to a Founding Father, She Sought Freedom in France, New York Times. I urge you to go read it if you're interested in that sort of thing, because it's very, very interesting. It's a great read. It's from a first-person perspective. The woman who wrote the article, her name is Martha Jones. Really, she did a very, very fabulous job. It's very touching. It's sad. It's very sad. But you can definitely find some things there if you're interested to learn more about Abigail, who seems to be probably the only enslaved person that we even know of regarding John Jay. Obviously, he owned other slaves, but Abigail seems to be somebody that even biographers of John Jay's have covered Abigail in some of the situations surrounding her over in Paris. So in sum, what are the principal legacies of, people and persons that we honor? That we hold to be so valuable in our history. People like John Jay and George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. What is it that matters? Was John Jay a fierce advocate for justice? With respect to the law and the practice of slavery, we have to recognize that he was a slaveholder in both word and in deed. However, the measure of the ferocity of advocacy for justice should also be measured by lasting accomplishments. With respect to the abolition of slavery in the state of New York, there was no New Yorker as persistent, politically skilled, and ultimately as legally effective as John Jay. That's just the truth of the matter. Now, just a little bit about John Jay and religion. John Jay was a member of the Church of England and later of the Protestant Episcopal Church in America after the American Revolution. Since 1785, John Jay had been a warden of Trinity Church in New York. As Congress's Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Jay supported the proposal after the Revolution that the Archbishop of Canterbury approved the ordination of bishops for the Episcopal Church in the United States. He argued unsuccessfully in the provincial convention for a prohibition against Catholics holding office. While considering New York's Constitution, John Jay also suggested erecting a wall of brass around the country for the exclusion of Catholics. John Jay, who served as vice president and president of the American Bible Society, believed that the most effective way of ensuring world peace was through propagation of the Christian gospel. In a letter addressed to Pennsylvania House of Representatives member John Murray, dated October 12th of 1816, John Jay wrote, "Real Christians will abstain from violating the rights of others and therefore will not provoke war. Amongst all nations have peace or war at the will and pleasure of rulers whom they do not elect and who are not always wise or virtuous. Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. He also expressed a belief that the moral precepts of Christianity were necessary for good government, saying, "No human society has ever been able to maintain both order and freedom, both cohesiveness and liberty apart from the moral precepts of the Christian religion. Should our republic ever forget this fundamental precept of governance, we will then be surely doomed." In 1801, John Jay declined both the Federalist renomination for governor and a Senate-confirmed nomination to resume his former office as Chief Justice of the United States, and he retired to the life of a farmer in Westchester County, New York. Soon after his retirement, his wife died. John Jay remained in good health, continued to farm, and with one notable exception, stayed out of politics. In 1819, he wrote a letter condemning Missouri's bid for admission to the Union as a slave state, saying that slavery ought not to be introduced nor permitted in any of the new states. Midway through Jay's retirement in 1814, both he and his son, Peter Augustus Jay, were elected members of the American Antiquarian Society. So you do have to say that even in his retirement, he did continue to fight for the ending of the institution of enslavement. He did. And he did obviously make it even political in 1819, as I just touched on. On the night of May 14th of 1829, John Jay was stricken with palsy, probably caused by a stroke. Jay lived for 3 more days, dying in Bedford, New York on May 17th of 1829. He was the last surviving president of the Continental Congress. John Jay had chosen to be buried in Rye, New York, where he lived as a boy. In 1807, he had transferred the remains of his wife Sarah Livingston and those of his colonial ancestors from the family vault in the Bowery in Manhattan to Rye, New York, establishing a private cemetery. Today, the Jay Cemetery is an integral part of the Boston Post Road Historic District, adjacent to the historic Jay Estate. The cemetery is maintained by the Jay descendants and closed to the public. It is the oldest active cemetery associated with a figure from the American Revolution. And we're going to get into that here in a second. John Jay's gravesite, yes. At his childhood home in Rye, New York, his boyhood home, in the back of this home, in the woods, literally in the woods, there's actually nature trails back there that you can go walk on and hike. All sorts of like nature trails. There's like wild turkeys back there and all that kind of stuff. And back there in the middle of the woods is the Jay family cemetery. And that's where John Jay's buried. And it has a huge gate fence surrounded by it with barbed wire. You cannot, as many of you know from my adventures doing this, grave hunting, I have hopped many a fence. I have hopped many a fence. I have army crawled underneath many a fence. I have found my ways into graveyards and cemeteries and everything else to visit these graves at times. This is one of those that you cannot do that. Number one, there are cameras nearby that you will get caught. And number two, you could get very badly injured. There is barbed wire. They take very good precautions on making sure that it is fortified so nobody can just walk in on their own. This cemetery is 100% closed to the public. It is a private cemetery. It is only open to the public one day a year. That is it. One day a year. You have to check the J Heritage Center website to find out. Now, when Henry and I visited, we actually went there with Kurt Dion, good friend of ours, from kurtzhistoric.sites.com, and of course, also of the great author Kurt Dion of Presidential Grave Hunter, his wonderful book. But yeah, so we went there and visited with Kurt, myself, and Henry. It was Memorial Day. Now, usually that's the day that they open it for the public to come visit the cemetery, Memorial Day, every year. However, I believe that there has been years in the past that they've also done it on Veterans Day in November. So you have to check their website, the J Heritage Center. I believe it's like jheritagecenter.org, maybe, is the website. But if you go onto their website, you can find out what days it will be open and accessible to the public. But again, it's usually only one day a year, maybe tops 2 days a year. That's it. If you try to go and you're like, oh, can somebody open it up for me? No, there's nobody there. There's nobody to open it. You can't climb the fence. So check the website. Maybe, we're releasing this video mid-October. Veterans Day is in November. So maybe this November 2024, it will be open and you can go visit if you would like. It is awesome. Henry was wrong on his observation and his opinion of the grave is not great. Yes, his grave itself is not like overly extravagant, but just the fact that it's a private family cemetery, it's the only one still active from the American Revolution. It's on the property of the homestead that he grew up in as a boy. It's just awesome. The fact that it's only open one day a year to the public, so it's not like... There's a lot of people that have never been there, even grave hunters, such as myself. There's a lot of grave hunters that I've spoke to that love to go visit graves of people that tell me, yeah, they've never made it to John Jay's grave. So it's very cool. I'm going to show you all of his grave stuff in bonus footage. We're going to save that for bonus footage in the end of this video. So, but it is awesome, I promise. So, just some fun facts, obviously, about John Jay. He's obviously known for being an American founding father, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the second governor of the state of New York. He went to King's College, which is now Columbia. He obviously negotiated the Treaty of Paris and Jay's Treaty, named after him. A famous quote of his in the Federalist Papers is, "It is too true, however disgraceful it may be to human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it." Wonderful quote by John Jay. Very interesting. Just seeing here what else. Legacy, geographic locations. There's several locations within New York that are named for him. Fort Jay on Governor's Island, John Jay Park in Manhattan, all sorts of stuff. Obviously, there's a university, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York is named after John Jay, which is very cool. There's high schools named after him in New York. There's been postage stamps. Jay's hometown of Rye, New York, issued a special cancellation stamp on September 5th of 1936. There was also one on December 12th of 1958. The Postal Service released a 15-cent Liberty-issued postage stamp honoring John Jay. So there's a lot of different things honoring the legacy of John Jay. You know, there's a lot of people in history who, somebody, for example, like John Adams. John Adams spent a lot of time defending his place in history. John Jay does not spend a lot of time on that. In the end, John Jay was more worried about America than he was about John Jay. And that's a legacy that will live on forever in history. John Jay, pretty interesting guy, a very important man, somebody who technically did run for president several times, did not win, received electoral votes as we learned. And there it is, the life, legacy, death of John Jay, one of our founding fathers. So, that's going to wrap things up here for John Jay. Please leave your comments, questions below. We love those. Hit subscribe, give us a like, share our video. Also, keep in mind, I just wanted to give you guys a little update. This is being released, obviously, the week of October, 17th and 18th. Next week, so the week of basically October 21st, 22nd, 23rd, etc., we will not be releasing a video. Reason being, I have some family coming into town from out of state. They will be staying with Henry and myself, so we're going to be visiting with family for several days, which will be very nice. We're looking forward to it, very excited, and we're just not going to have time to do a video. But we are 100% going to be returning the following week, Halloween week. And probably the next video after this one will be released on Halloween, Thursday the 31st. So look out for our next video. We're looking forward to it, of course. And that's about it. Stay tuned for the bonus footage of John Jay's gravesite, so you can take a look at my photos from that. And other than that, happy birthday, Henry. Happy 11th birthday. Love you very much. And you're turning into a wonderful, wonderful young man. And I hope all of you have enjoyed watching Henry grow over these last 4 years, because obviously our adventures and such have been lasting memories for myself. So, thanks so much, guys. Thank you for everything, the support, everything that you guys do. We really appreciate it. And we will see you in about 2 weeks from now. So, be well, stay safe, stay healthy. See you guys soon. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now. Hey, guys. TJ here with Dead History. Before I show you John Jay's gravesite, I wanted to actually just read something that I had found about Abigail, the enslaved woman that John Jay had owned, the African-American enslaved woman. I just wanted to read you a little bit about her. This is not from the New York Times article that I had referenced. This is just something, a little side note, but I think it's very important to try and tell her story and bring it to light, so I wanted to just add this in. Abigail, who died December of 1783, called Abby, was an African-American woman enslaved by John Jay. She died after attempting to escape in 1783 in Paris, where John Jay helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris to secure America's independence. The Jay household enslaved Abigail since at least 1776. She was one of at least 17 people that John Jay enslaved. In 1779, she was the only enslaved person that John Jay and his family took on their trip to Paris. When John Jay left for London in 1783, his family and Abigail remained in Paris. His wife Sarah regularly wrote to him about the household's affairs, and it is from this correspondence that almost all that is known about Abigail is drawn. While Sarah's letters initially praised Abby's attention and proofs of fidelity and her usefulness, she was isolated in Paris with few friends or opportunities to make any, and separated from her loved ones in America. In the summer of 1783, she suffered from a toothache and rheumatism. By then, it appears that she felt unsettled. Sarah suggested that an English washerwoman might have enticed Abigail with the promise of wages in exchange for her work. In October of 1783, Abigail left John Jay's home, intending not to return. At Sarah Jay's request, the Paris police searched for Abigail and found her in the English washerwoman's company. By lettre de cachet, she was detained in La Petite Force. I'm probably pronouncing those French terms incorrectly, and I apologize. That was the women's wing of the city jail, the Hotel de la Force. But Abigail refused to return to the Jays unless she was promised passage back to America. John Jay reacted to Abigail's escape attempt, writing that he could not conceive a motive for it, given that he wrote he had promised to manumit her upon our return to America, provided she behaved properly in the meantime. He wished for her to be punished, though not vigorously. On the advice of Benjamin Franklin, he suggested that she could be left in prison for 15 to 20 days to change her mind. Little minds cannot bear attentions, and to persons of that class, they should rather be granted than offered. To his biographer, Walter Starr, this reaction indicates that however much John Jay disliked slavery in the abstract, he could not understand why one of his slaves would run away. While imprisoned, Abigail fell ill and asked to be allowed back to the Jays. William Franklin arranged her release by paying 60 livres to the jail, probably to cover her meals. Still sick, she was cared for by Sarah Jay, but died about 2 weeks after her release from prison. There are no graves, no records, and no signs of her life remain. May she rest in eternal peace, and may we always remember Abigail. Hey guys, TJ with Dead History, and here with Henry. And it is Memorial Day 2022, and we're actually at the John Jay Estate and John Jay Cemetery, the Jay family cemetery. I think it's actually where all this barbed wire fence is. So I think we gotta go right back through here. It's somewhere back here somewhere. So we'll film more in a little bit. Right, Henry?
Every America's Cup ship was built between the 1890s and 1930s, all the 60s. It's nice.
Now we're gonna
Our Morgan descendants built